Welcome, Benny Miller from University of Haifa. This is our continuing conversations on peaceful change. I'm visiting your lovely campus and beautiful city, historic city of Haifa, and it is a pleasure to be with you. And today we are going to talk a little bit about your new book that's coming out of University of Chicago Press, American Grand Strategy from Truman to Trump. And tell us a little bit about this excellent idea, how you got the idea, what's the gist of it, very briefly for our audience who may not know what you are working on and the purpose. Why did you write this book at this time?
Yeah, very good question, and it's a great pleasure to have you here, Professor Paul, at the University of Haifa. And we are longtime friends and colleagues, and it's another opportunity to discuss all these great issues. Actually, the idea came after the 2003 American invasion of Iraq. The puzzle was really a great puzzle. Why would the United States invade such a distant, faraway country without posing an immediate threat to American national security, at least not in the classical sense? And also supposedly having this aim of regime change and imposing democratization. And then to think more broadly, how does it fit or doesn't fit the overall kind of American grand strategy post 1945,
Right.
and to try to account for the key changes, but to look for a relatively simple, a parsimonious explanation of
Okay.
all these changes.
Big picture, yes.
Right, right. Starting from the early Cold War years,
Yes.
and whether the same factors can account for all these changes. Obviously, some variation in these factors, some changes in this factor can account for all the changes from Truman to Trump and
Yes.
in between.
So there is continuity, although you find some changes.
Yeah.
But the
Some-
continuity needs to be explained. That's what you are trying to
Yeah,
do.
the continuity is that always the idea is to maintain, preserve American national security,
Yes.
but they are completely different and competing ideas how to do it.
Yes,
And I kind
visions.
of identify four approaches.
Okay, explain a little bit what are those four approaches and how do they account for the continuity and change?
Right. Yeah. So two approaches focus on power. One, power maximization.
Yes.
That the United States should be the hegemon, should be superior to its competitors,
Right.
and only then that will guarantee American security, national security. Then the other one on power is power restraint. To be very moderate, because otherwise you will generate an intense security dilemma. You will frighten the others, and there will be an arms race, and that will make America national security worse
Yes.
rather than better.
Yes.
Then two completely different ideas are focused on intentions, or more specifically on the type of regime, and of the other side, kind of the fundamental intention. One is more moderate,
Right.
trying to encourage cooperation, so international
So
institutions.
it's more like the liberal approach.
Right, right. The more I define it as defensive liberal, the more moderate. Then there is an offensive liberal, the idea that actually you can impose democracy on other countries and rivals, especially those
Intervention, through
right,
interventions.
right. But let me explain just briefly the logic behind. The logic behind it is that liberals believe in the universality of the liberal tenets.
Right.
Namely, it's not limited to the West, like the clash of civilization idea, the Huntington, but it's really universal.
Yes.
And just there are other people, other nations who are imprisoned by their despots, by their dictators, and the America can come and liberate the people.
yes.
So the American soldiers should be saluted, should be welcomed there. So
But they have created a lot of problems
Right,
in that process.
right.
The interventions have not gone
Right,
smoothly.
right,
And there
right.
is a counteroffensive by the not so liberal forces.
Right.
And that creates a lot of challenges for America because on the one hand it's ideological liberalism. On the other hand, it behaves like any great power empire of the
Right.
past offensive, its own interest. So there's a conflict between this liberal peacefulness
Right.
or whatever versus realpolitik oriented, national interest driven, the kind of divisions that you noticed. So how do they justify the use of both in one grand
Sure.
strategy?
So it's an excellent point. I will distinguish here between the Cold War and the post-Cold War era. In the Cold War, and the logic is that once you have a great power competitor, then the system, the external circumstances compel you to behave in a realist or power-oriented fashion, and you cannot really focus too much on the question of regime and intentions and all of that and shaping that because it's too expensive and it's too luxurious under these circumstances.
Yes.
However, when you're the sole superpower in the system, then you can afford, at least potentially, to think about changing the other forces in the system and making them liberal like you because of a number of reasons. One is economic, then obviously you will have free trade and all this economic independence.
The Adam Smith.
Right, right. The second idea is ideological. If you Americans at least used to be until Trump believe sincerely in liberalism and its universality and so on, so why it wouldn't succeed? And then security. Supposedly the idea that if you make the other great powers or other threatening powers into democracies, when they grow up and become stronger, they wouldn't pose a threat to you because they will be democracies. And supposedly, according to the democratic peace theory, the idea that democracies don't fight each other, they wouldn't pose a real threat. So you have a number of reasons why to try.
This was actually the reason why the US opened up to China considerably, hoping that China would become rich and democratic.
Absolutely. Yes. Actually, I tried to address all the key attempts at liberalization. So China, Russia, in different ways, and the Arab Muslim world. China was indeed, it was through trade, globalization, and especially joining the WTO, the World Trade Organization, 2001, and then making China part of globalization, international institution, integrating it, and so on. That to some extent succeeded. On the other hand, it completely didn't make China into liberal democracy or something.
So that's where the so-called offensive realist idea comes from, because they would argue that whatever ideology you talk, and for the Chinese and the Russians, it's basically power struggle. You are the great empire, we are another empire. Our status needs to be recognized in our own ways. It doesn't mean that we are going to accept your mode of governance or your system. What you're trying to do is to impose your hegemony on us. How do Americans think or look at that criticism these Russians or the Chinese make?
Right. Yeah, I think the realist logic opposes American behavior, the post-Cold War American behavior, and trying to shape the domestic character because they say it's futile, it's costly, and it's dangerous.
Yes.
So you really should avoid that and just maintain the balance of power and think about your security in kind of the realist power ideas, not trying to shape ideologies and so on. So I think they oppose it. But still, I'm trying to explain the behavior by systemic explanation. So even though it's counter the realist...
By systemic, you mean international level explanation.
Right, right. Namely, that once you are the sole superpower in the system, you have this tendency to try to shape other because of all this ideological, economic, and security. Then the distinction is between the offensive and defensive variant. The defensive would be when the system is benign, when it doesn't look, at least not in the foreseeable future, that others pose a major threat to you. And that was the situation in the 1990s. The United States, the sole superpower in the system, but the system looked very benign on the whole and so on. This changed in 9/11 because 9/11 supposedly clarified to Americans that the system is, the external environment is still threatening and there might be major threat. And then the idea came, this offensive liberal, namely to change, even if by use of force, the regime of others, especially if the part of the world from which the 19 kidnappers came, which was the Arab world, which by the way was the only, by the early 21st century, was the only region in the world in which there was no a single functioning democracy. So the Americans made this association. Terrorists come from the Arab world, and there is no democracy there. So it's a reason. So because there is no democracy, Al Qaeda could emerge in the Arab world. So if we make them democratic, then Al Qaeda will disappear and will.
So in a way, it is this highly realpolitik oriented, George Bush and his associates, Cheney and all those people, using liberal idea buying liberal idea, but with a very realist bent of mind, changing them according to our
Yeah,
image.
I would call it offensive liberal. I would say the following. After they came to power, obviously they were a very realist group. All of them, Condoleezza Rice and Rumsfeld and Powell in different ways. And all of them were against regime change, democracy, human rights, humanitarian intervention, all this. They associated it with Clinton and they condemned it and thought it's useless. But this changed after 9/11, and that's one indicator that highlighted my argument that the external environment, that something that happened externally can change the behavior of decision makers in a major way. So suddenly Bush and all the key decision makers adopted this, what is called usually neoconservative, what I call offensive liberal idea, that in order to reduce the national security threat coming from Al-Qaeda, namely from the Arab world, that is probably Al-Qaeda.
So your theory is very much systemic that way, because it gives primacy to the system.
Right.
And the threats coming from the systemic forces.
Right, and the distribution of power. The combined effect of distribution of power, distribution of capabilities, whether it's a sole superpower or there are great power parity, that's one factor. The other factor is the level of threat. There is a high threat environment, or is it a very benign environment?
So is it kind of a neoclassical approach, or is it more than that?
Yeah, to some extent it's a systemic kind of Waltzian, but on the other hand, it does have the neoclassical realist in the sense that the external environment shapes the domestic debate, and through the domestic debate, it also shaped the decision maker perceptions, and so on. So I have some role for the domestic and perception, even though still I think that the systemic, and especially these two factors, the balance of threat and the solution capability, shape the domestic debate, the domestic struggle between different approaches. And
one of the criticisms people like Mearsheimer makes of liberalism, or liberals in general, you are fundamentally realists. When it comes to American national interest, you act like realists. Even the constructivists, I have never seen a constructivist who is opposed to American hegemony. Maybe the critical theorists are, but not the mainstream IR as we see. They all want the American hegemony to stay on as long as it can. They may have visions, different approaches to how the hegemony should look. I think that Mearsheimer argument has some relevance, isn't it? The liberals, are they really truly liberals if they say it's my system has to dominate, then only the world will be better,
No, I do think that the hardcore of the academic realists like Mearsheimer, Wald, Posen, and so on, oppose a liberal foreign policy, and they think it's disastrous, but still there is a puzzle for them how they explain the American behavior. At the very least, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, after December 1991, when the system became unipolar, they expected America to behave in realist terms and to avoid all this regime change and all these liberal ideas, and that didn't happen. So the puzzle is why this is so. And I explain it supposedly by realist terms, but I call it systemic, even though the derived behavior is actually non-realist, is anti-realist, and they condemn it. So it's nice that they condemn it, but that's for policy debate. It's not for explanatory purposes. They don't have the explanation why the behavior, for almost 3 decades. So it's a real puzzle.
Yes, but there is the other side of it, which is whatever gives legitimacy and durability to American hegemony is this liberal idea. What is missing in the case of Russia and China, for instance? They don't have a universal, before the communist period they had.
Right.
But today they are very much for themselves. It's the empire kind of building. The American hegemony could persist even after it is gone materially because of some of these elements of, what it is continuing, which is liberal idea and the idea of freedom, institutions, all that the US has been helping to set up, but of course right now it's in a different mode of setup already. So the question is, how do realists account for that kind of legitimacy, durability? Classical realists did, because not the modern versions. Classical, Morgando and all had some understanding of legitimacy of power,
Right. Yeah, I think the modern realists just basically they have this policy advice to either to maintain American dominance or at least to maintain the balance of power in the key regions of the world. You know, the
Stability,
offshore, yeah, the offshore balancing, namely to avoid the rise of a hegemon in one of these three key regions which affect the global balance of power, or the Posen idea of restraint. Just behave very moderately, trying a bit to disengage and not to intervene too much, and definitely also to encourage your allies to take care of their own security, especially if they are rich, like the Europeans, the Japanese, maybe even the South Koreans, to take care of their own defense spending and so on. And the United States shouldn't be there because it might lead, at least inadvertently, to America engagement in fighting.
It's a bit like the old isolationist argument.
Yeah, no, I would say it's a limited isolation.
Yeah.
An interesting question in this context is what are the similarities and differences between Trumpism and realism?
I want to bring you to that question.
Sure.
Trump is, in your chapter, you are putting him kind of a different category, not in IR theory yet. Offensive, illiberal, nationalist, or whatever. The question is Trump an anomaly, or is he passing phenomenon in terms of theoretical, this grand tradition, or is he going to leave some ideas behind for American grand strategy?
I'm afraid it's not a completely passing phenomenon. I mean, Trump personally, obviously, yes, because it's the way decision making.
Idiosyncratic.
He's very unique. But the logic behind it, and there is a certain logic, even if it is not able to express it and to, in a coherent way and so on, there is a certain logic in it. One is the high cost the United States paid for this liberal, especially the offensive liberal, what he calls the endless wars, especially in the Middle East. And there is a constituency that definitely likes this idea of disengagement, definitely from the greater Middle East, including Afghanistan and Libya and all the Arab world and all of that. Secondly is the rise of China and the changing distribution of capabilities also lead to kind of new thinking. But also thirdly, there is a domestic component, and this is the identity issue. And that's the changing character of American society, which is one of the key reasons of the rise of populism. White nationalist populism, because these people feel that they are losing their control of American society because also the colored people are going to be the majority in American society. The white are going to lose their majority and potentially their
So
dominance.
one other thing about American grand strategy has been this reasonable domestic consensus. Still, despite all the differences that America should lead in a post-war period, America should promote all this. But with this societal divisions of this nature developing, some groups are going to say, let us fix our things here, not go into. What does that do to American hegemony? I mean, there is a good chance that some crisis could happen. And then the same people will say, let's go and fight, So the American grand strategy or this threat perception is cyclical in that sense, When the threat, like your theory says, the threat comes, they change.
Right.
The same people will say, let's go and fight,
I think the key variable is the rise of China and particularly the type of behavior that China or the perception of China is. If China is perceived indeed as the liberals, especially defensive liberal, thought initially, integrated into the international system, to international institutions and encourage globalization and trade, it will be more kind of a defensive realist behavior vis-a-vis, trying to maintain the balance of power, but not be too aggressive towards it and try to accommodate it. And but if China indeed continue, for example, in the maritime dispute, this construction of artificial islands and let alone, let's say, invasion of Taiwan or a major security threat to Taiwan or to India or to any other of its neighbors, I think that will give ammunition to more kind of an offensive realist in the sense that it will be a similar policy like to the Soviet
That's
Union.
what I want to talk a little bit about. The Chinese grand strategy so far has been quite careful, except Xi Jinping's a little bit of more pushy. Belt and Road Initiative, the US is not counteracting, and nobody is as much as they expected. So the Chinese are avoiding security dilemma by playing this way of economic expansion without too much military, although they are doing some, it's not still perceived as threat, sufficient level of threat in Washington to start another big Cold War. Although now we are hearing a lot about the coming Cold War, but still there is a reluctance because this is the number one trading partner of most countries in the world today. In Asia Pacific, although it is doing a lot of things, it is not going to lose its connections to all the small states. So America will have a tough time finding allies to fight if there is a real threat. So how does that fit into this grand strategy mix that you are providing? How does it explain you have a different kind of a rising power, which is very clever in its strategy, using economic opportunities, but not necessarily threatening as big as Soviet Union did, for instance.
Right. But to some extent, there is a changing in the landscape of the debate in DC in the sense that there is a greater support for the idea that China become more offensive than until few years ago, until Xi Jinping, began a more assertive policy, both economically as well as strategically.
Yes.
I think the consensus was that indeed integrating China into the international system, it will become, it will be a status quo power, initially satisfied. It benefits a lot from globalization, from trade, all of that, and give it the right place in international institutions and so on. But I think now it's changing, partly because of the assertive economic policy, trade and so on, and Trump used it for the trade war. But also strategically, I mean, looking at the South China Sea, and remember this quarrel with the Philippines, it was brought to the International Court of Justice. They decided in favor of the Philippines, and China just doesn't comply. And obviously, it's difficult to compel China to comply.
Yeah, but what is noticeable is the reactions by these powers are still muted. They sent through some ships U.S. Freedom of Navigation.
Absolutely.
Even the Philippines occasionally make some noises, but there's no consistent effort to stop the production or building up of all these little forces they have and islets, etc. What do you think the expectation that China will one day slow it down, or what is the expectation?
Yeah, definitely there's some slowdown in the economy and so on.
Yeah.
But I think that there is a perception that China wants to be the dominant power, at the very least in Asia Pacific. And that's something the United States cannot concede, because this is now the most important region for the global balance of power, for global trade, for global economy, and so on. So America cannot concede, so it would lead to, at the very least, intense competition between the US and China, who is going to be the dominant power. Like it used to be in Europe, now it shifted to East Asia.
So, but it could be a different form of rivalry, because the trade could still continue. And still, I mean, the Britain and Germany had trade, by the way, before World War I.
And it didn't
prevent the war. So that's the question. A crisis can come even in such a relationship. And the system is not ready for, managing such a crisis. So based on all this analysis, what does it mean for the final discussion is sort of for the regions, such as the Middle East? The great powers, this grand strategy, what does that do for regional order, for peace in this region or order in this region?
No, I think it has a major implications, because at the very least, since the Camp David Accords, the peace treaty between Israel and Egypt in the late 1970s, the United States was the key broker of Middle Eastern conflicts. Now it is changing, partly because of disengaging America, especially under Trump, even though it started also under Obama, at least partly. And on the other hand, Russia more assertive behavior, and also the regional powers, the non-Arab regional powers, Iran, Turkey, and Israel. And that makes the region much more dangerous than it used to be, because there isn't this acceptable broker. To some extent, Russia is trying to play this role and to fill the vacuum left by the United States. But Russia, I think, has a lot of disadvantages and compared to the United States, and is a bit more aggressive and so on, and also not completely sure that it will be able to play this role. So I think there is going to be a very intense kind of global regional competition. and especially the rising,
re-emerging, yeah.
yeah, and especially the rising regional powers, Iran,
Yes.
Turkey, and
Yes.
Israel, and particularly the Iranian-Israeli conflict is definitely a very dangerous stage.
Yes.
And the question, Russia tried to play the broker in this conflict,
Yes.
but I'm not sure it's trusted by the parties as the United States used to be, at least for a while, between at least the mainstream Arab states and Israel. Now it's less trusted and play its own game. But to some extent, it's already a big change that Russia is trying to fill this vacuum left by the United States.
So, Benny, thank you so much for this nice conversation, and we'll continue this discussion once your book comes out. Hopefully, we'll have more panels and discussions. The book is supposed to come out by the end of the year from
Right.
University of Chicago Press. It is an extremely interesting discussion of American grant strategy from a theoretical point of view. Thank you so much, Benny.
Thank you.
Pleasure.